All right, welcome everyone this evening to the first of two presentations that we are going to discuss about my direct paternal line, the Lehmann family. We've done a lot of different presentations over the last few years focusing on various branches of the family. And I think the first one I did discuss a few years ago was about the Lehmann family, but we're gonna go into a lot more detail tonight, tracing back the ancestry to a town in Germany called Weiterstadt. And our focus tonight is really going to be on that community in Weiterstadt and our family within that community. So without further ado, let's get started. So I wanted to sort of set the stage here with tracing back the Lehmann line to this town of Weiterstadt, because it wasn't just a linear thing where our family came straight from Weiterstadt to America, as you all know. It was over several generations that we trace back to Weiterstadt. So our Lehmann family lived in Germany in a few different cities from at least 1780 until the 1930s. Grandpa Henry was born in Leipzig, and his father, Leo Lehmann, we have the little tree here tracing back the Lehmann line. Leo was born over here in southwestern Germany, so Leipzig's in eastern Germany over here in the green. In the blue here is Karlsruhe, which is where Leo Lehmann was born and where he lived until he moved to Leipzig. And Leo's father, Bernard, was in northwestern Germany in a town called Krefeld. That's where he was born in 1861. And it's only to, Grandpa Henry's great-grandfather, who Uncle Rene is actually named after. His name was Simon Lehmann. He was born in Weiterstadt in 1828. So even though we have to go back all these different generations, our Lehmann ancestors lived in Weiterstadt the longest out of any other community in Germany that we know of. So, I mentioned that we'll go back to 1780. We're going to talk about 1780. Our family was living there back then. And all the way up until the 1850s, our family was living. Our direct ancestors were living in Weiterstadt. That's over 75 years, about 70 years, 75 years. And that's longer than any other community, where basically it was just one generation in one town, one generation in the next town, one generation in the next city. But we spent the longest time in Weiterstadt, although it was the earliest back. So we're going to talk about, the late 18th century through the mid-19th century for our section of the family. So what can we, and you can see it's all over Germany. That's actually pretty unusual to see so much movement across Germany. A lot of times you see, just movements within the same region of Germany. Our family actually moved around quite a bit. And, when our family left Weiterstadt, they actually moved to a different country. Weiterstadt was in a different country than where Krefeld was up here, which was part of Prussia. So it actually involves, emigration from that country. So let's continue. And let's talk a little bit about the Jewish history of this region, starting with the medieval Jewish history of Germany. I think it's important to have some background here, before we talk about Weiterstadt itself. So Ashkenazi Jews have lived in the German Rhineland region for over 1,000 years. But until the High Middle Ages, the focus of Jewish settlement was really in three different communities, which are all highlighted in red right here. They have a red underline. And they were Speyer, Worms, and Mainz. And they had this acronym called SCHUM. So they were all located on the west bank of the Rhine River in southwestern, western Germany on the Rhineland. That's where the main focus of Jewish settlement was. Now, those cities are very close to where Weiterstadt is today. In fact, Weiterstadt is located on the east bank of the Rhine River, so it's not on the west bank. But it's only 30 kilometers southeast of Mainz and 40 kilometers northeast of Worms. So it's basically between Mainz and Worms, but just on the eastern side. Very, very close to these cities that, again, had Jewish populations going back more than 1,000 years. But that area east of the Rhine was not populated by Jews until at least like 1300. This area that was further east of the Rhine, it was a rural countryside area, and Jews didn't really, there's no reference to Jews in this area until at least 1300. So just again, going through Jewish history very quickly, the medieval period, it had, times of stability and toleration, but also times of difficulty. So just I've named a few different events that happened: the Crusades in the late 11th century and in the 12th century. We had the bubonic plague in the 14th century, the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, and then between the 14th and 17th centuries, there were expulsions from many different communities in Germany. So again, the Jewish population was always in flux. There were times where they were tolerated, other times that they had to move and go to other places. In terms of, the rural countryside area, a very seminal expulsion was in 1615 in Worms. So, Worms again is very close to Weiterstadt, but on the other side of the Rhine. In 1615, there was the expulsion of the Jewish community. And although Jews were then allowed to return a few years later, not many did. And it's only after 1615 that we see a lot of these rural communities near Weiterstadt start to have Jewish populations. Like a few Jews are living there. And so it's presumed that a lot of the Jews living there had been originally from Worms and ended up settling in the countryside. So in terms of like the early modern period, when we're starting to talk about, potential Jewish population in the area, it probably dates to the 17th century after that expulsion. So I wanted to talk a little bit about professions, and one of the main professions in this area of Germany, which again was very, very rural, was the cattle dealer trade. This is something that also comes up in Alsace, and some of our ancestors partook in it in Alsace as well. But this was also an important trade in Weiterstadt. So I want to spend just a couple minutes talking about what this trade was. So in this rural countryside, where Weiterstadt is one of many different communities, very small communities, Jewish families, had made a meager and modest living. Most of them were peddlers and traders. I talked about the period of toleration. Even though they were tolerated, Jews had a lot of special taxes. Probably the biggest one was the Schutzgeld, which was a renewal for their residence permit for them to be allowed to live in a German community. So in this, the cattle trade was one of the big sources of income for a lot of these rural communities in and around Weiterstadt. So what did they do? Jewish cattle traders, they would travel to many different markets, and they would mediate with sellers and traders and try and get fixed premiums for their services. So what were they doing? There was an important need for cattle traders, for an intermediary to trade cattle. So why was this? Well, when animals reached a certain age, they had to be replaced. The old animals were sold to slaughter. Young animals were then brought to the market or from a dealer. So a cattle dealer could save a farmer a lot of time and money if the farmer didn't have to visit the market himself. If the cattle dealer would come to him and be like, "Look, here's your cattle. You don't have to buy your new young cattle." That would save him a lot of time. And especially for the Jewish cattle dealers, they played an important role for the less wealthy farmers, because they would allow the farmers to pay either in installments or in kind. So they could, and over periods lasting several years. So for a poor farmer, a Jewish cattle trader was like a lifeline, where they would be able to get their cattle. They would have a long time to be able to pay it off. They wouldn't necessarily have to pay it off in money. They'd be able to pay it off with some of their produce that they would be growing on the farm. And again, this was a trade that Christians did as well, but it was very dominated by Jews.
Do they charge interest?
For non-Jews, yes. Yeah. There would be interest involved on the transaction.
Because the Jews had to put out the money to buy the cattle.
Correct. Yeah, they would be
It was
paid
like it
back.
was a layaway plan. It was
Yeah,
an
exactly.
installment sale.
Correct.
Hmm.
Well, that led to tension also, over time with, when things were going badly for those Christians who were dealing with them.
And what if the farmer didn't pay them back? Did they have like a lien on the cattle?
Yes, they would be able to take the cattle back. Correct.
Oh, really? It
Yeah.
was like,
Yeah. So a cattle dealer, like, they just knew all of the cattle in the region. They had this comprehensive knowledge, and they were often referred to as a walking newspaper about the available cattle in the region. It was very important for, again, this was a rural countryside. Almost all of the people there was a lot of farming going around, a lot of farmers, and a lot of need for cattle. Um, and so, really beginning with the introduction of railroads in the mid 19th century, it started to disrupt that trade. But there were Jewish cattle dealers that continued to exist in these places, even in Weiterstadt into the 1900s. So it still existed as a trade, but it was greatly diminished. So I was able to find this one picture from the late 19th century in Alsace of a cattle dealer, hauling one of the cattle, but couldn't find one from our area of Germany that we're talking about. But these regions are very close. Alsace is just to, also to the west of the Rhine, just very, very close to these communities in Germany.
we had a friend in Boston whose father was a cattle dealer in Goshen, New York.
Oh wow. Were the
And
fam was this a family trade going back to Europe
I
too?
don't
That they
know, but this was, mid 20th century. He was expert on buying and selling cattle.
wow. Wow,
Jewish.
maybe you know what? Maybe it could transfer. Those skills could transfer over to rural areas of the United States. But yeah, this was a big trade, and it was the dominant trade in this part of Germany in these rural areas. I also wanted to spend a few minutes talking about religious life for this area of Germany, to just get a sense for. And again, I've gotten this from books on this region that are written in German, just that provide the sort of introduction. So I'm really just summarizing the material that they presented in this book that I read. But the rural Jews of this region, they had this popular piety, and they were connected to practical mysticism. So local customs included hanging amulets in the bedroom when a woman was giving birth to protect her. They would embroider or paint sewn pieces of a child's diaper worn during the circumcision and write the words about, a child should grow up to do good deeds and go to a wedding. And in this area of Germany, at a Jewish wedding, the bride and groom would be pelted with grains of wheat to wish them fertility. So these are customs that we know existed in these areas. One really interesting custom that I learned about, that again was pretty prominent in this area of Germany, but also in Switzerland and in Alsace, was this custom called the Holocaust, and it was a ceremony for the birth of a baby, and the children of the neighborhood would be invited to come in, and they would announce the secular name of the newborn at this event, and they would recite the Ten Commandments. There would be some blessings, and what was interesting about this is that this ceremony meant there would be a celebration for girls in addition to boys. They made sure that both baby boys and baby girls would be celebrated, and there would be a naming celebration. So I thought that was really interesting, and that goes back hundreds of years. I mentioned the rural communities here. They were small. We're going to go into the numbers here. Weiterstadt was very small. And so because of that, there weren't a lot of Jews in these communities, and it must have required a high level of religious discipline. Almost all men over the age of 13 would be needed for a minyan because these communities were so small. Jews generally did not have their own synagogue. They would worship at their local house minyan, local neighborhood minyan in a private residence. Only later, maybe in the 19th century, were there some formal synagogues that were built. Weiterstadt never had its own synagogue. This town never had one. But a nearby town called Gräfenhausen they did have a synagogue, but only by the 1890s. So basically, these are people who are praying in their own homes for the most part, or another Jewish home. They did not build synagogues.
But they had a Sefer Torah.
They would have had a Sefer Torah, presumably, yes. Until the early 19th century, children usually went to school with a private tutor, and several families would employ the private tutor. Now, this was way more advanced education than the Christian community, where there wasn't really much schooling for the farmers. They were not getting schooling. They weren't learning to read and write. Now, Jewish children, they were taught Hebrew or Yiddish, and it seems like in Weiterstadt, German was also later taught. We know that starting in 1823, in all of this area, there was compulsory state schooling that Jews had to attend. And at that point, there were elementary schools created and that were controlled and regulated by the state, but that were meant for Jews. But we know for sure that the Jews got some sort of Jewish education and knew how to read and write, at least in Hebrew. And we'll see evidence of that in some future documents. But again, the German was taught usually at a later point, and not necessarily early on. And then one final point is that these rural Jewish communities, they were very small, so they had centralized cemeteries. There would be one cemetery for a handful of towns where people would be buried. You see this all over in Western Germany. This was the case. You see this also in Alsace. In a lot of these rural places, there would be a centralized cemetery where a lot of different Jewish communities would bury their dead. And so Weiterstadt was no different. Weiterstadt the dead would be buried in this town over here called Großgerau. That is where the cemetery existed, where Jews were buried from Weiterstadt. You can see all the way over to the east here is Gräfenhausen. So Weiterstadt is all the way out east. They would bury their dead further west here, but this is all east of the Rhine still. It's not that far away. All these towns aren't that far away. Now, the cemetery in Großgerau, it still exists today, but there was an older part of the cemetery that was basically destroyed in the Shoah. So a lot of our ancestors, I have not been able to find their graves in Großgerau, but I know that they are buried there. Our Lehmann ancestors were buried there. All right, so let's talk about... We talked about some, broader, talking about the profession and talking about religious life. Now let's talk about where we start to see records of Jews. And that is in the 1780s. And so why is that? Why did we start to see records of Jews beginning in the 1780s? Well, at that time in this area of Germany, which this was still part of the Holy Roman Empire at the time, it was a state within the Holy Roman Empire, there was growing concern about the Jewish population because there were a few wealthy merchants, but there were also small traders and peddlers who were barely, making a living. And then there were also these begging Jews who would wander around the country. And it was difficult for the government to really have a proper accounting and also taxation of these Jewish communities. And so in 1783, the nearest city to Weiterstadt is a city called Darmstadt. That the government in Darmstadt, they appointed a commissioner for the affairs of urban and rural Jews. And then in the next year, this government counselor, he presented a memorandum and had several proposals that were approved, including, so starting in 1784, they had to register all of the Jewish population in tax registers. They had to introduce the German language in business documents. And they needed to register births, marriages, and deaths of Jewish residents. So beginning in 1784, it was mandated that all of these civil records would be kept, and they assigned the duties of this to the Protestant pastors. So the Protestant pastors in these towns had to start keeping birth records for the Jewish population. There was also some professional support for Jews to help open up new sources of income. But that was a little bit more limited. It would open up a lot more in the 19th century. So it's precisely during this time where all of these events are going on. where they want to start recording Jews and have better tracking of Jews, that we first see the Lehmann family mentioned in records living in Weiterstadt. So I wanted to just like focus in here on the right-hand side of the page. I love this. So this is actually the opening page for the birth records in Weiterstadt for Mennonites and Jews. So beginning in 1784, they began keeping records of births for not just Jews but also Mennonites, which means this is a subsect of the Amish. They lived out here in these rural communities, which makes sense. And they were Mennonites that were living nearby to where our families were, and we're grouped together, the Jews and the Mennonites together, in this document of birth records. And it is also cool that they use as this title, they have this all in Latin, although the records themselves are in German. So I talked about how Weiterstadt was a really small Jewish community. Let's put some numbers here to get a sense for how small. So the community itself was always very small. In the 19th century, in the first half, we have a few different periods where we have a good number on the population. In 1829, there were 575 people in the town. By the time we get into the late 1920s, there are over 2,000 people. But the Jewish community always stayed, between 12 and 25 people. There were never more than 25 Jews in Weiterstadt at any one time. So in 1829, there were 19. It reached its peak in the low, here in the low 20s around 1900. But by the 1920s, there were only 12 Jews again. And as a percentage, you can see here with this line, in 1829, about 3% of the population were Jewish, but it got down to less than 0.5% by the time we get into the 1920s. I mentioned before this other town that was nearby, that was Gräfenhausen. That town was a little bit bigger, and so that had upwards of about 60 Jews. So think about like 2 to 3 times the number of Jews. And we do know that, those Jewish communities were very closely linked. So probably like for minyan purposes, they probably davened together. I would think that they prayed together at some point, because I think the Weiterstadt Jewish community at times was probably too small to even have a minyan. But Gräfenhausen had more, and they were within a mile walking distance to each other. So it wasn't that far to be able to walk to the neighboring community in Gräfenhausen. And it's Gräfenhausen that eventually had a synagogue in the 1890s. And so because this was such a small rural community, it's probably no surprise that Lehmann family members would eventually leave Weiterstadt for other places. Not everyone could just stay in this town because it couldn't maintain Jewish families just living there and growing there. Okay, so now let's talk about, we've had enough of this introduction, let's talk about the earliest Lehmann ancestor that we know about. And his name was Abraham Isaac Lehmann. So most of these early records, they only refer to him as Abraham Isaac. Now, why is that? Well, this was before the adoption of the Lehmann surname. And most Jews, before the formal adoption of surnames, would use a patronymic name. So what is a patronymic name? The first name would be their name, and their second name would be their father's name. So we actually know that Abraham Isaac, that his father's name was Isaac, and that he was Abraham Isaac, but we do know his father's name. Now, we know that Abraham was a Schutzjude, which means he was a protected Jew. He paid a special residential permit fee in order for his family to live in Weiterstadt. And so because was common for centuries for Jews in German lands, that they would have to pay an annual fee in order to be able to live to live in these communities, and they were not considered citizens, so they had no rights as citizens. Abraham had 5 children that we know of, but only 3 surviving children, and they were all sons. So I list them here. We have the 3 surviving sons were Zacharias, Bunim, and Hirsch. And we descend from Bunim, the middle of these three surviving children. Out of these three children, Zacharias and Bunim stayed in Weiterstadt. Hirsch moved to the bigger city nearby of Darmstadt, and he moved there in the 1810s, by I think the middle of the 1810s. So when he was in his early 20s, he left the community. So we see, even with these early generations, not every descending child stayed in the town. We already see people leaving in the early 1800s. People weren't staying. But his two oldest sons, Zacharias and Bunim, they stayed in Weiterstadt. And so up here on the right-hand side is a tax record from 1780. This is the earliest record that I've been able to find of our Lehmann ancestors. And if you can read the handwriting, it says here, Der Jud Abraham Isaac. And he paid this residential Schutzjude, residential permit fee. He had to pay 2 gulden in 1780 in order to have the right. Now, what's also interesting here is that he is the only Jew in 1780 living in Weiterstadt. At that point, it was just him, and presumably, potentially, he was married at that point, but there were no other Jewish families. So he was the first Jewish family in Weiterstadt.
And do you know where he was from, Jeremy?
We don't know where he was from, so we don't know. My guess is that he was not originally from Weiterstadt, that he was from another town, but we don't know. And it would be great to be able to figure it out, but with these rural communities, it's really tough because, again, the records only start in the 1780s. With finding records, it's like all relative to where you are, where the family was living in. And this is pretty far back if you compare it to other ancestries in like Russia and other places, that going back to the 1700s is like very few people can do that. 1780 is pretty far back, it's this is well before the Lehmann surname was adopted. So we'll talk about it, but the Lehmann surname was adopted sometime between December 1808 and 1812. This is a record that's about 30 years beforehand, where we can see the family, way before the Lehmann surname was ever adopted. So I also want to spend a little bit of time talking about these early birth records. We saw earlier that front page about the Mennonites and the Jews that was kept by the pastor. These are, so the Protestant church, they began keeping records of the Jewish children in Weiterstadt beginning in 1784, which is when they were mandated across all of these towns. They all started in 1784. And from these records, we actually have the birth records of 5 of Abraham Isaac Lehmann's children. Because fortunately, they were all born after 1784, starting in 1784. So it just worked out with the timing. We got sort of lucky that, Abraham Isaac was having his children just at the time that they were beginning to record Jewish births in these Protestant church records. So
where are these records now? Like, how did you get access to them?
So they are held still by the Protestant church in Weiterstadt. There is this website called Archeon, which is they have digitized almost all of the church records across Germany.
Oh, wow.
And you can pay a fee. So I paid a month's fee to access these records. I had to find them, but they're pretty organized by town. And I knew where I needed to be looking for. And so I was able to find them online and download them. And so they're all on the tree.
Amazing.
But I do have links where if you want to click on the link on the presentation, it will take you to the webpage that has these pages as well. But you will have to pay a monthly fee in order to see it online. But they're already on the tree.
Is Germany unusual in digitizing these kind of records?
Yeah. Definitely. They're way ahead of the game. They're excellent. So, these Protestant church records go back usually to like the 30 Years' War. So talk about like 1650s or so. A lot of the Christian population, they can trace back their ancestry usually to the mid 1600s, but usually no further back because the 30 Years' War devastated that whole region. and we don't really have a lot of records from before then, but that still goes back another 100 years. So Weiterstadt has records going back further than this from the Protestant church records, but they only began recording the Jewish births in 1784, which is still something. So here you can actually see it. Abraham Isaac, you can see that this is him, and he's a Yud, he's a Jew, a Schutz Yud actually. And here in 1785, he's naming his son Zacharias. So that's the oldest son. We're going to talk about him. His Hebrew name was Yisachar. It was not Zachariah, it's Yisachar. That was his Hebrew name, but he went by Zacharias too. And then probably the most interesting one is the birth of our ancestor, Bunim. So so this is the birth record. It's on two different pages. That's why this is the bottom of a page, this is the top of a page. We can still see the Abraham Isaac. We can see that he has a son, and his name was, and this is written by the pastor, right? So he wrote the name in Hebrew characters and said Ben Avram. Now he didn't really know how to write in Hebrew so well because he wrote a vav here instead of a bet, and he wrote from the first word on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side. So if you can read Hebrew, you can see this pastor. I've been able to get in touch with this wonderful archivist in Weiterstadt, and she told me that these pastors, they got some training in Hebrew, but it was pretty limited. So I think this guy, he wanted to write Ben Avram, but even though this is the only place that we see the name listed as the son of Abraham, he in all other records is listed as Bunim, and later on people are named Binyamin after him. So Bernard Lehmann is named after him, and he had it's not clear exactly what his Hebrew name was, but on this record, this earliest record, he's listed as just Ben Avram, which is still really interesting that we see Hebrew on this record, and it's written by a Christian pastor, a Protestant pastor. He actually wrote it. Okay, so another important set of records that exist in Weiterstadt are these Juden records. So these were the tax for Jewish families. We already saw one from 1780, that earliest record where Abraham Isaac paid 2. It's a really rich source of data for learning about the Jewish community. So from 1780 up until 1820, we have these records about the Jewish families, and it would be the head of household that would have to pay to represent the whole family. They would have to pay a certain amount in taxes. Now, beginning in 1821, it gets discontinued. So in that year, community citizenship was granted to the Jewish communities, not to individual Jews, but to the communities. And so they were treated less separately. We start to see some more formalized birth records that are kept as civil records and not as in church records beginning in the 1820s. And so that is coincident with this community citizenship. So we only have this 40-year period where we have these Jewish taxes records. So thankfully I've been sent all of these records that exist. Again, the archivist in Weiterstadt, she's amazing, and she sent them over to me. So I try to see, were there any trends that could be gleaned from these tax records? So I mentioned in 1780, there's only, and so I sort of have a summary chart here between 4 different people who are paying taxes over that 40 years. So in green here, you have Abraham Isaac Lehmann, that's our ancestor. He paid 2 gulden in 1780. The next one that we have, and again, these were annual taxes, in 1790, which is the next source, he's now upped up to paying 3 gulden. He's paying 3 gulden a year. And there's also one other family that's joined the community. And they were the only 2 Jewish families for a very long time. His name was Israel Gottschall, and he also was paying 3. And we know that 3 gulden amount, that was sort of that was the same that was charged to Christian resident aliens. So Christians who were living there that didn't have citizenship, they also were charged 3 gulden to live there. So it was equivalent. It wasn't like Jews were getting charged extra than the Christian non-resident, non-citizen population. Well, what you see starting in the first decade of the 1800s, starting in 1807, you see the green bar drop off. And Abraham Isaac starts paying 1.5 gulden, which was 1 gulden and 30 kreuzer. That was 1.5. He had a 50% discount. And the reason given was economic hardship. Okay? So he was having a tough time economically, and his taxes were reduced. Starting in the 1810s, we see Abraham's eldest son, Zacharias. He starts paying the tax starting in 1815. He is at the 3 gulden amount, but his father still is at the 1.5. And then we even see by 1820 that even Zacharias is back to this 1.5. He also gets his taxes reduced. So both Abraham Isaac and his son Zacharias had some economic hardship during the first half of the first couple decades of the 19th century. It's important to have sort of context here, what was going on, right? These years in 1807, 1808, this is the Napoleonic era, and there was a lot of economic hardship that occurred during this time, especially afterwards. And so there was actually a recession that took place in the late 1810s in this area, and it's not surprising that you would see some Jews suffer as well. But our family in particular, we can see it in the data that they had economic hardship. In 1820, Abraham ended up not having to pay any more taxes at all, and because he was poor and also he was of old age. At that point, they said he was at least age 60. But he probably was older than 60 by 1820. So again, there are important records to see that. Here on the left-hand side, this is from 1817. You can see just, again, really beautiful writing. This is actually the first record where Abraham Isaac, where we see him have the Lehmann surname. So right over here, it's spelled Lehmann. And he's paying this 1.5, that 30 kreuzer and 1 gulden, which is 1.5. And Zacharias is right below him, also Zacharias Lehmann. He's paying 3 gulden in 1817. But this is the first year where we see Abraham have the surname Lehmann. That's in 1817.
Do you know how they chose these surnames?
I do not. It's a great
Or
question.
were given them?
Well, they definitely chose. I think they chose them. But we'll talk about it a little bit about what the Lehmann surname means. But it's there. I've got a potential theory of how they chose it, but it's just a theory. It's not. We don't know. We do know that Lehmann, that surname was a common surname in Germany, and a fair amount of Jews adopted this surname. So you were leading me up to the adoption of the Lehmann surname and adoption of Jewish surnames in general. So again, before this time period in the 18th century, Jews always used patronymics. But in December of 1808, this is again during the Napoleonic era, all Jews in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, which is where Weiterstadt was located, they had to legally accept surnames. So that there was a decree that was given in December 1808. But we don't see the Lehmann surname until 1812. So even though that first record with Abraham Isaac Lehmann's not until 1817, we do see the Lehmann surname beforehand with Zacharias. So Zacharias in 1812 has a daughter, and it says, here's the record. This is the first record that we see the Lehmann surname that I've been able to find. And it mentions Zacharias Lehmann, the local Schutzjude, the protected Jew. He had a daughter, and it mentions that the daughter, his wife, and his father-in-law was deceased, was born on March 16th, 1812, between 5 and 6 a.m., The child's name was Gutchen, and the name of the child's maternal grandmother was also Gutchen, and she's named after her. So it's a great record because you can find out the name of this child's grandmother, who is not from our family, because this is the maternal grandmother, not Zacharias' family. But we see here the first record, and we see it spelled Lehmann. So this is how the Lehmann family has spelled the name, with two N's at the end, and it's been there from the beginning, at least from 1812. So what does the Lehmann surname mean? It derives from the Middle High German Lehmann and Lehmann, from lehen, to hold land as a feudal tenant, and man, in man. So what it meant was to, as a person, it meant like a man who held land as a feudal tenant back in the High Middle Ages. But it could also mean someone who owned land, okay? And we'll talk about it, but our Lehmann family owned property in Weiterstadt that existed for quite a long time in the family. And so they might just be referencing that they actually own this property by being Lehmanns. They own land here in Weiterstadt. But again, the name evolved. It became very popular among German-speaking communities. Even today, there are a lot of Lehmann. There are a lot of Lehmanns. Both Jews and non-Jews took on that surname. But we get asked the question, like I get asked the question a lot. Oh, do you know such and such a Lehmann? Do you know such and such a Lehmann who also spells it with two N's? 99% of the time, we're not going to be related to those families because
interesting situation that one of my professors said, Barbara Lehmann, are you Mennonite? That's a real Mennonite name. So
oh, interesting. Interesting.
It's a very common name in Germany. You see it in stores all over Germany. Yes. Lehmann.
It is very, very common. So, but even among Jews, like our family was very small. We can trace it to this small little rural town, and it is not clear that any other branch of Lehmanns would be related at all to us. It seems like unlikely that they would be. And so far I haven't found any other evidence of other families that adopted the Lehmann surname that are related through this Lehmann line. So we're a small subset of lots of different people who have the surname Lehmann. So the other interesting thing, we talked about how it was spelled in German, in the Latin script, but we also know how it was spelled in Hebrew characters, which is also pretty amazing. So we see here in 1823, Zacharias Lehmann signs his name in Hebrew or Yiddish in the death record of his father. So Abraham Isaac, he dies in 1823. And we see that he lists his name as Sacher Lehmann. And we'll talk about the first name first. He writes his name as Sacher, which is not how you spell Yisachar, which has a sin and a chaf. He has with a sin and a chet. But it's almost like a play on words, I think, because Socher means merchant, and he was a merchant. So he's sort of like, his nickname was Sacher, but he was the merchant Sacher. And in his last name, we see the last name Lehmann spelled as Lamed Ayin Mem Nun Sofit, which is really the Yiddish spelling for how you would spell Lehmann. Instead of having, you would have the Ayin as the second letter. But, our family today now spells it Lamed Hey Mem Nun Sofit. That's really like a Hebraicized version of this Yiddish spelling with the Ayin. Yiddish has a lot of Ayins in it, but I think we have faithfully adapted the spelling to how it would be spelled in Hebrew. But anyways, it's pretty amazing to have the spelling in both, Yiddish and also in Hebrew, and to be able to see how they spelled it. All right, so I mentioned on the previous slide about owning land. Well, the Lehmann family owned a home in Weiterstadt, and it shows up in a bunch of different records. And it started off as house number 33. That's how it's mentioned on records. So, for instance, this is Abraham Isaac's death. That same record where we saw Sacher sign his name. It says here, house number 33. That's where Abraham Isaac lived. He owned this house, number 33. And it seems very likely that this family had been the family home for a long time, right? Because we know that Abraham Isaac had lived in this town since 1780. Most likely he'd been living in this house for quite a while before he died in 1823. And, if my theory's right, at least when they adopted the surname, maybe 1808, 1809, that era, he probably was living in the house at that point too. So it's in this house where, Abraham Isaac died. It's where we know that Bunham's son, Simon Lehmann, who Uncle Rene was named after, my third great grandfather, that's where he was born in 1828. It says that he was born in house number 33. And it's also where Bunham died. My fourth great grandfather, or Simon's father, Bunham, Abraham Isaac's son, Bunham, died in 1855. They were all living in this house, number 33. So what's pretty remarkable is the house stayed within the family, within the Lehmann family, for even further in the ensuing generations. So it was owned by Bunham's grandson, whose name was David Lehmann, who lived until the early 1940s. And over here on the right-hand side, again, this is the archivist in Weiterstadt. She found this and sent this to me. So in the 1880s, again, he owned this home. It probably was in bad shape, and he decided to do a reconstruction and rebuild the home. And so these are actually the construction plans that got approved for the house. That David Lehmann, he still owned the property, but he was rebuilding the house. We can actually see what it looked like, that it had 2 floors to it. And this is sort of the layout of the plan. This is from 1886. So this is Bernard Lehmann's first cousin, David Lehmann, who was just a little bit older than him. This is, this was the floor plan that was approved, the engineering plan that was approved for the home. But it was in the same location where the earlier Lehmann family lived. So over the years, house number 33, it became house number 99. So it had just a number. And then eventually it was a normal street address that we have in Germany today, where you have the street and then the number. So today, this location is Darmstadter Strasse 37 in Weiterstadt. The location still exists, but the current house that's there dates back to 1955. So we still know that that location is where our family lived, but it's no longer it's not the same house that was built in the 1880s and not the house that existed when our ancestors lived there, but that location still exists. And that address is still there in Weiterstadt. It's the main street in Weiterstadt today, in the central part of the city. Okay. So I want to mention here, the trend towards modernization that occurred during the 19th century, where you start off in the beginning of the 19th century. This is very rural, religious community, not so integrated with secular society, and then a more broadening out as the century goes on. So we can just see some of those indications in the records with our family. So I love this record. This is Bunham's oldest son. His name was Abraham Lehmann. This is our ancestor Simon Lehmann's older brother. He's getting married in 1850, and the 2 people who sign as witnesses on this civil marriage record are Abraham's father, Bunham, and Abraham's uncle, Sachar, who we've seen his signature before. This is Sachar Lehmann again. So his signature didn't really change much from 1823 to 1850. You can recognize it right away. He signs it the same way. But Bunham Lehmann always signed in German. He never signed in Hebrew. And he had this beautiful German handwriting, too. So I love his handwriting. And this actually says Bunham, and this says Lehmann. It's written in current script, so some of the letters might be a little bit harder. Like the H looks like an F here. Also, the L looks a little different. The B's look a little different, but you can easily make out the M-A-N-N. This is his own signature in 1850, and all of this ensuing generations now. Bunham was just a few years younger. He was born in 1791. Sachar was born in 1785, 6 years difference. But Bunham is much more comfortable in using German, and he's 6 years younger. And we also see, as the Lehmann family grew, that descendants were leaving Weiterstadt even more so. So the trend that you typically see is that the eldest sons, they would tend to stay in Weiterstadt. So, but most of the other children would then leave because there just wasn't enough. There wasn't enough space, basically. And again, in the first half of the 19th century, you had to get approval to be able to live there, and you had to pay taxes. And if you weren't approved, you weren't able to have a family and live in these towns. So they had to move. A lot of times they were forced to move elsewhere because they weren't given approval, and the town was too small anyways to house them. So we see, starting in the 1840s and 1850s, a much bigger exodus of the Lehmann family from Weiterstadt. And obviously this is the time where our family left Weiterstadt. Simon Lehmann, he left in the 1850s to go to Krefeld. All of his children were born in Krefeld, in this much bigger city in Prussia. He left Hesse, and he went to Prussia in northwestern Germany. And he married a woman who had Dutch ancestry, because this was very close to the border with the Netherlands. In 1848, though, so that's our family, our branch. We moved to northwestern Germany in the early 1850s. In 1848, well, there was also that was a really important time. There was a big revolution that took place in Germany during that time, and afterwards, citizenship was finally granted to all Jews. So really, in 1848, for all intents and purposes, it seems like that's when Jewish people in Weiterstadt really became citizens. Although even after that point, they can still be referred to. Some of the older Jews could still be referred as Schutzjud. But officially, that status ended when they got citizenship. But having citizenship had certain requirements. And one of them was you had to join the Hessian army as a citizen if you were a young male. And for Jews, they never had to join the army before this because they weren't citizens. And so we know that even though there were no wars going on in the 1850s, there was nothing going on in wartime, but they didn't really want to join the army. That was also another reason that Jews left and went elsewhere. And we actually know that's exactly the reason why Simon's younger brother left Germany. So Simon's youngest brother was named Meyer Lehmann, and there's this amazing record of from Weiterstadt, from this area, saying that in 1852 he was emigrating to North America to evade military service. It says this on this record. Meyer Lehmann was leaving Weiterstadt. He's emigrating to North America. He doesn't want to serve in the army. And so we know for him that was definitely the reason. Meyer also had an older brother named Jacob. The two youngest brothers of Bunham's two youngest sons ended up going to America. Meyer went to Buffalo. This person who was evading military service, he went to Buffalo, and his older brother went to Cincinnati. So 2 out of the 4 brothers of these Lehmann brothers, who were born in the 1820s and early 1830s, they left Germany completely and went to America. And our ancestor left Weiterstadt as well. So there was only one child that ended up remaining in Weiterstadt. So I want to sort of visualize this here about where were these Lehmann family members that originated in Weiterstadt. These are all descendants of Abraham Isaac. Where were they around the 1850s? So for the most part, even if they weren't living in Weiterstadt, they were living in places really close by. So I have a lot of different communities. These are all communities that are in Hesse that are pretty close by to Weiterstadt. Now, we still have family members that remain in Weiterstadt as well. Now you can see our green marker here, that's where Simon went. Simon went to Krefeld, and he was a butcher. We know that he was a butcher in Krefeld, which is like an adjacent type of thing to cattle trading. Then you need to have Jewish butchers and stuff. We know that was his profession. We know that Bunham, his father, was a merchant of some sort, but we don't know which. But in Europe, we have, one in northwestern Germany, in Prussia, which again was a different country. We had one that moved to Alsace as well, which is actually pretty unusual to cross the border into France. But one of the descendants of Zacharias went to Alsace. And then we also know of a few descendants that went to America by the 1850s. So we already talked about Meyer in Buffalo and his older brother Jacob, who was in Cincinnati. There was also one other descendant who went to Philadelphia in the 1840s, this was Zacharias' branch. Now, I've lost track of her. I would love to be able to figure out what happened to her. But she married someone named Levy, which is a very common last name. It will be a little tricky, but it might be possible to trace down, where that went after she moved to Philadelphia. So then we're going to fast forward 50 years to about 1900, and you can see where this family was living in around 1900. And again, it's not all that different. A lot of the same regions, but the big thing is that our family moved again from Krefeld all the way to Karlsruhe. You can see that green marker moved. And then there was some more from the branches that I've been able to trace. Again, I haven't been able to trace down that Philadelphia line, so I don't have it marked here. But from the two brothers that were in Cincinnati and Buffalo, they branched out a little bit. One lived in Iowa. There was a branch that lived in Iowa, in eastern Iowa. And then there was one that lived in northern Pennsylvania near Buffalo as well. So these were the American branches of the Lehmann family. Another way to visualize it is to see a family tree and just to highlight in green the families that remained in Weiterstadt. Everyone else left, okay, during their lifetimes. So up top here we have Zacharias Lehmann. That's the oldest child who we do not descend from. And this is Bunim. Each of them only had one son that stayed in Weiterstadt. Zacharias had his oldest son was Isaac. He stayed in Weiterstadt. Bunim had his oldest son, Abraham, who's named after Abraham Isaac, the grandfather. He stayed in Weiterstadt. All the rest of Abraham's siblings, including our ancestor Simon, they left Weiterstadt. So this is just a visualization just to show all this family that was leaving Weiterstadt and not staying there. And then I also wanted to trace it down into the early 20th century so you could see that it continued in subsequent generations, where more branches of the family that were still in Weiterstadt were also leaving. So these were Isaac. Remember I mentioned he stayed in Weiterstadt. He was Zacharias' son. He only had one son that we know of, and the Michael, whose name was Michael Lehmann. And Michael had only 3 children who stayed in Weiterstadt out of his 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 3 out of his 8 children stayed in Weiterstadt, and this goes into the 20th century. And then out of Abraham's descendants, so Abraham, this is the son of Bunim. This is from Bunim's side. This is Simon's brother. So these are not branches of our direct ancestors. They're cousin branches. There were just 2 children. There was Marx and there was David. We've talked about David Lehmann, who rebuilt the house in Weiterstadt in the 1880s. It was just him and one of his brothers. They're the only ones who remained in Weiterstadt. So again, this is just a visualization to see how there was a big exodus. A lot of families left. Again, there were no more than 25 Jews in Weiterstadt, and most of them were our Lehmann family at any one time. We were the majority family in Weiterstadt, a Jewish family. So I wanted to fast forward a little bit and talk about the Weiterstadt Jewish history, because there were Lehmanns that remained in Weiterstadt up until the late 1930s. And back in 2013, the Weiterstadt archivists, they put together a really nice piece talking about the 1938 November pogrom. So in Germany, they refer to Kristallnacht and the events subsequent to Kristallnacht as the November pogrom, which again means a pogrom that took place in November. And I think it's a better suited name for what took place in Weiterstadt because of the events didn't take place at night in Weiterstadt. It actually took place the following day in Weiterstadt, where there was a pogrom in the city. And so I wanted to just spend a few minutes to talk about that pogrom that took place, because it was written up in this article. And again, most of the individuals who are mentioned are our family members who were involved in this pogrom. So what happened? So this is now the following morning after the first night of Kristallnacht on November 10th, 1938. Weiterstadt's mayor, who was a doctor and dentist, he received an order to initiate this Jew action. And so he enlisted the support of an SA man named August Feller to help him with carrying out this order. So they involved the fire brigade, and they went first to the Lehmann family home. They went to Darmstadt Strasse 37. This is the same home, the same location where our Lehmann ancestors were living, going back more than 100 years. They're going to this location, and they're joined at that point by crowds of students. And living there was David Lehmann. So this David Lehmann, who rebuilt the house in the 1880s, he's an elderly man at this point. He's born in 1851. So he is 87 years old. And we know he sold textiles, but he also traded in livestock. So he was involved in this cattle dealing trade, going back, into the early 20th century. And he's living there with his wife, Sarah, and their daughter and son-in-law, Setchen and Max Stern. Max had been a butcher, but then he joined the Lehmann family business in Weiterstadt starting in the 1920s. Similar to like our Lehmann family, joining the father-in-law's business in Leipzig and doing the egg business that happened oftentimes with the son-in-laws. So they had to sell that business, though, in the late 1930s. So that's the background on who's living there. It's this David Lehmann, his wife, and his son-in-law and daughter-in-law. So it's the crowd of SA men, Hitler Youth, and others, again, incited by the mayor. They broke the windows in the house. They damaged the furniture. They threw goods into the street, including large bottles of champagne, fruit, and other food dishes, laundry, and dry goods. And then all of the male Jews were taken to the mayor's office, including David Lehmann, who at that point was half blind. And again, we have these witness statements after the fact, so we actually get a little bit of a sense. He said, "Kill me, I'm an old man." Okay, he was so upset. He was just like, "You should just kill me." And they said that when they were taken out onto the street, they weren't properly dressed, and David had under his arm a cash box where he had money from the family, and he was crying. So we have all these details from what happened at this point. So Max Stern, who was the son-in-law, he was taken to the Gestapo. He was imprisoned in a camp for another month. And I thought this was interesting that after this event took place, the Weiterstadt pastor, the Protestant pastor, wrote in his own remarks, he was writing about it, he said, "Hopefully this won't come back to haunt us." He was clearly, having some regrets about what took place in the town. So after this pogrom, David and Sarah, the elderly couple, as well as the daughter and son-in-law, they left Weiterstadt. So first they were able to go to another town in Germany, but by January 1939, there were no longer any Jews living in Weiterstadt. In fact, there have been no Jews in Weiterstadt since this point. Our Lehmann family were the first Jews to be there, and they were also the last Jews to live in this community. Now, David and Sarah, they were actually able to successfully emigrate to Great Britain. David died in 1941, but he died of old age, not of hardship during the war. He had descendants that lived in England. We're going to cut back to this next week and talk about a little bit more about David Lehmann's descendants. Now, Setchen and Max Stern, so this is the daughter and son-in-law, they died in the Shoah, and they were sent out east to the Hrsg ghetto, and they were murdered. So we have Lehmann family members that were killed during the Shoah, including these two individuals. So after the end of the Second World War, these pogroms in November 1938, they took place in Weiterstadt. They also took place in Gräfenhausen, these two communities that were closely linked. They became the subject of two trials that took place in West Germany after the war. So that mayor who helped instigate the pogroms, he had fled, but he was eventually brought into custody in January 1948, and then they sentenced him later that year to just 1 year and 10 months in prison. There were a couple others who were also imprisoned as related to this. And I mentioned this SA man, August Feller. He was sentenced to 8 months in prison, and another accomplice to 3 months in prison. All of these sentences were more lenient than what the public prosecutor had demanded, and all of the sentences were suspended after a certain period of time. So they only served a portion of their sentence of just a few months in jail for the most part. It's an open question of whether they received any sort of justice for their involvement in this. And then the last thing here is that, as many of you know, there are these stumbling blocks called Stapelstein that exist all across Europe, where they mark on the street or on the sidewalk. They have, again, they're called stumbling blocks. They're like stones where they mention names of Jews that used to live here. And where our family residence, you was, and for hundreds of years, at 37, at Darmstadt 37, you can find the Stapelstein of our Lehmann family members. In fact, David Lehmann and Sarah Lehmann and Max Stern and Session Stern born Lehmann, you can see this right outside. So if you want to visit the ancestral location of our town, you will see the Stapelstein of our Lehmann cousins who lived there in the 1930s. So I think that's pretty remarkable that there is still a Lehmann presence in these stones where our Lehmann family resided. So we'll do a little summary here, and then I will take you through just a couple of primary sources in the appendix that will be interesting, and then I can take questions. So just as a summary here, the Lehmann family we can trace back to the town of Weiterstadt in Hesse in western Germany. It is located near some of the oldest Jewish communities in the German Rhineland, going back 1,000 years. Like, we don't know. We can only trace back the Lehmann family, to 1780 in Weiterstadt. Is it possible they were living in this area for 1,000 years continuously? It's possible, but we really don't know. And what I have found in other parts of my research is that it can surprise you. People could be living in a certain area and then have moved quite a bit. So we don't actually know, but almost certainly the Lehmann family had been living in Western, Europe for the past 1,000 years. It's unlikely they were ever in Eastern Europe. So most of these Jews who were living in this rural part of Germany, they were poor peddlers and traders. We talked about the cattle trade. And the earliest Lehmann ancestor, his name was Abraham Isaac. He had financial struggles in the early 19th century. And around, between 1808 and 1812, we know that the Lehmann surname was adopted. So it dates back over 200 years, but no further than that. Most descendants of Abraham Isaac Lehmann, they left Weiterstadt in the ensuing generations. Most went to German-speaking communities, but there were others that went to Alsace or to the United States. And a few branches of the Lehmann family remained in Weiterstadt up until the 1930s. But that ended following the November pogrom in November 1938. The remaining Jews all left Weiterstadt by January 1939. It ended a 150-plus year period of Jewish presence in the town. And members of the Lehmann family, they were among the last Jews to reside in Weiterstadt. So this is actually a picture of what the city looks like today from the air. In the 1970s, Germany, especially West Germany, they underwent a process where they incorporated lots of other smaller communities into making them into larger communities. So now Weiterstadt is actually incorporated all these other towns. So it used to be Gräfenhausen was this bigger town compared to Weiterstadt, but Weiterstadt in the 1970s incorporated it. So if Gräfenhausen doesn't exist anymore, Weiterstadt does. It has over 20,000 people now today living in the town. And, the archivists, they service all of these different communities that used to exist. But it's Weiterstadt that still exists in name today in Germany. So before I conclude just with the main presentation, I really want to thank a couple individuals who were extremely helpful. A lot of these records are not online, okay? And you can't just do a quick search and find them. It actually requires communicating with archivists, and there were a few archivists that were extremely helpful. So the first one who I want to thank is this woman named Maxie Jennifer Braun. She works at the Weiterstadt Municipal Archives. I only connected with her just a few months ago, back in May, and she had just listed her name as someone who was researching the Lehmann family. So I reached out to her, and she said, "Oh, I'm the archivist in Weiterstadt, and I just so happened to have a 40-page report that I wrote about your Lehmann family," which was incredible. Okay, because there were only like one or two, main Jewish families. This archivist decided to research both of those families and try and determine all of their descendants. So she actually had already found on her own Leo Lehmann and Henry Lehmann, Renee. She already had those names in her tree, in her 40-page document. She had already figured all of that stuff out herself independently, and she sent all of that to me. But not only did she do that, she sent me those tax records, the Judengeld, which date back all the way to the 1780, and she also sent me books related to the broader Jewish history of the region. And again, really am deeply thankful to her. She's an amazing researcher and archivist and has done a really amazing job chronicling our family. Again, I have had no other instance where I've been researching a family where I reach out to an archivist, and the archivist already has done a 40-page report on my specific family. Like, it's pretty incredible. She really knows our family pretty well and the history of our family. I also want to thank others from the Hessian State Archives in Darmstadt, and George Siebert in particular, and also Dr. Volker Eichler from the Hessian Main State Archives. They also sent me scans of these birth, marriage, and death records between 1823 and 1873. That's the one where we see Sacher Lehmann signing in Hebrew. We see the house number 33. There's a lot of really interesting things, and we'll talk about it briefly in the appendix, just what some of these records look like from this later period, because they are pretty impressive. So I just want to thank these individuals, these archivists. They were extremely helpful with getting records that are not digitized. They're not online. You can't find them at all today. And they were really helpful with sending me these records. So it really helped enhance this presentation. Okay, so first I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about the appendix, and then we'll conclude the presentation. First is, these are a list of resources if you want to learn more about the Weiterstadt Jewish community. Some of them are books that are in German, so those are the first two. If you want to have that 40-page report and see through it, it's written in German about the Lehmann family in Weiterstadt. You can click the link on my Ancestry tree and you can be able to get the record. I can also email it to you. If you want to read more about the November pogrom, there's a lot more that was written about that occurred in both in Gräfenhausen and Weiterstadt. I just gave a short summary. That document also is on my tree, but I can send to you separately. If you want to see the Stapelstein, I showed one from our residence on Darmstadter Strasse, but there was also another Lehmann family living on another street. You can see what those Stapelstein look like. And then, again, I mentioned the church records on the bottom. There's also another individual, who researched Lehmann family from Weiterstadt, who independently has a website that is discussing that. So a lot of interesting resources. We're very fortunate that so much is written about the Jewish community, given how small it is. It's pretty rare to have so much information that we know about the Jewish community. All right, so I do want to just spend a couple minutes talking about some slides in the appendix that I think might be interesting. So this first slide, this mimics, we talked about tracing the paternal line on a map, talking about the different communities. Well, these are the birth records for all of these generations going back in time. So over here, we have Grandpa Henry's birth record in Leipzig, and you can see it got the stamp later in 1938 by the Nazi regime. You can see the swastika. And then going fast forward to 1892, you can see this was also partially printed, but there was also some that was written in. This is Leo Lehmann's birth record in Karlsruhe in 1892. And then we go back another generation to Krefeld, and we have Bernard Lehmann. He's born in 1861 in Krefeld. This is in northwestern Germany. And then finally, and you can see this is also a mix of printed and also written, but not as good handwriting. And then we get Simon's, and we get this record that's completely handwritten that has a special print. We have, again, this is Simon Lehmann. This is the first direct ancestor born in Weiterstadt in 1828, but we can see again through these birth records going back in time from 1929 back 100 years earlier to 1828. I thought this was pretty neat to be able to put these all on one slide. This one also I want to talk about briefly. So during the Nazi era, the archivists were very interested in recording the Jews that used to live in these Jewish communities. And so in the 1940s, remember, there were no longer any Jews living in Weiterstadt starting in January 1939. But in the 1940s, this is dated 1943, they decided to go through those Protestant church records. They went to the Protestant church, and they wanted to record every single Jew that existed in these towns, because they wanted to trace them down, I guess. They wanted a good record. So this is actually a very nice summary of all of the records from our family and from Israel Gottschalk's, the other Jewish family that was living in Weiterstadt during this time. You also see the Nazi insignia. Now, what I find really interesting is that we have the 5 children of Abraham Isaac. The third one, they just list as son. They don't know the name. Why don't they know the name? It's because it's written in Hebrew. Ben Avram. They have no idea. They couldn't read the Hebrew. And so the Nazi regime couldn't record the name. So they had trouble tracing our direct line of ancestry because they couldn't read. They couldn't read what was written on the record. We know why they couldn't read it, because it wasn't written in German. So I thought that was interesting. We stayed hidden from the Nazis, in that regard. Okay. So these are some Juden records, just more examples from 1790, 1800, 1813. I like this one on 1813. This is Zacharias Lehmann. We find out that because he's a new resident, he's a new official family resident, he gets 2 years of freedom. So he doesn't have to pay for the first 2 years. So it's actually written there in that note that he gets 2 years free, and then he has to start paying taxes. Have here a little bit of a slide, I'm not going to go really into it, about the money and the currency that they used back then. In the South German states, they had a certain set of currency. They used Gulden and Kreuzer and Hellers. In Northern Germany, like in Prussia, they used a completely different set of current coins. So you have to sort of know, you can tell based off of the currency which part of German-speaking lands they were in. This is a 1 golden coin. The golden were tied to silver. So Gulden and Kreuzer, they were tied to silver. Heller was a copper coin. But they had a specific exchange rate to silver that they warranted. They were tied to the value of silver. Now, the question is, how much was that tax? I was really interested. How much is that 3 golden tax that they had to pay, that they had to get cut in half? Was it really onerous? Hard to tell, because it's really, really hard to say. It doesn't seem like a lot of money based off of what I've read. It shouldn't have been a huge percentage of their income. It's not like people were paying 40% of their income to the city government with this tax. It doesn't seem like it, but I think he basically wasn't making money. It probably was barely breaking even, and so that's why he had his taxes cut. But I have here just some information that I found that was given to me by the Weiterstadt archivist. She mentioned these pages where you can sort of get a picture what monthly wages were, what was a cost in some of these places. But it's hard to say because this was a rural area and not a city. But this is an actual coin from this area from the 1840s. This is just another record about houses. So you can see just when the house was passed down to different ancestors. So Abraham Isaac, he died in 1823, but his wife was still living, and she was still living in the house. But she passed down in 1833 the house to both of her sons, 50% each, to Bunim and to Zacharias. So both of them were living in this house. It must have been a big house with enough room for both of these families to live in. And then we see in 1856, this is after the death of the 2 sons, that the home was passed down to only Bunim's oldest son, Abraham. So it stayed in our branch of the family, in the Bunim branch of the family, with Abraham. And then Abraham passed it down to David Lehmann. It's Abraham's son, David, who rebuilds the house. So we can see these exact years of when the house got transferred, which I thought was very cool. I had no idea a thing like that existed. And then I just have a few slides here on the civil records from the 1820s to 1870s. I have them all translated here, so you can take a closer look here about exactly what's mentioned in the records, and you can read the German. I just want to point out to a couple of them here. So this is Simon Lehmann's birth record that we saw earlier. I have it here translated. So you can see he was born on February 7th between 10 and 11 o'clock at night. and that he was given the name Shimon. He was named Simon. His Hebrew name was Shimon, which was Uncle Rene's Hebrew name. And we also have the name of the midwife. And the midwife's name is the same person. She's the same midwife. She was a Christian midwife who appears in all of these birth records from the family. She was the dedicated midwife, Anna Margareta Ham. And again, on this birth record, we do have Bunim's signature on here at the bottom, which is really cool. The father. These are other birth records. This is a birth record for the younger brother Mayer, who moved to Buffalo from 1833. A little bit nicer handwriting, very similar. But here is Abraham's wife's death. So what's important about this death record is it mentions that, first of all, I thought this was interesting in the German. She says, she was inspected by the doctor that she is really dead. So they had to confirm that she was dead. This is Abraham Isaac's wife in 1836, and that she has been buried in Grossgarau. So this is actual proof that she was buried, and almost certainly all of our ancestors were buried in this cemetery, going back to the 1830s. Now, there are later Lehmann family members that are buried in Grossgarau where their grave still exists, but none of our direct ancestors, I can't find any of their graves, but we know that Miriam, Abraham Isaac's wife, is buried there, and presumably all of the rest of our ancestors are buried in this cemetery. This here is just the Abraham Lehmann who stayed in Weiterstadt. He's the grandson of Abraham Isaac. This is his birth record and his marriage record. We already saw some of this before with Bunim Lehmann's beautiful signature here. But we also see Bunim signing here in 1823. We actually have Bunim's signature on here, which is, again, he has a really nice handwriting. And he's writing in German even in the 1820s. He's never writing in Hebrew or Yiddish. And that's going to be about it. This is just, I just have different towns, exact towns in which branch of the family where they were in the 1850s and in the 1900s. So with that, I'm going to stop the recording.